We are all communicators in different ministry contexts, and we need to know how to sharpen those skills so we communicate effectively with our listeners or with our readers. So today we're going to talk about 4 ways of sharpening our skills as communicators, and we're going to base this on something that's iconic here to Fort Worth, and that is the Chisholm Trail. Today, the Chisholm Trail is a tollway that runs through Fort Worth, but it is named for the Chisholm Trail that was the cattle trail back in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. So I want to talk about love the story but forgot the lesson. 4 ways to help your people remember your points. The Texas Confederate soldiers, when they were coming back from the Civil War, found that their longhorn cattle, the herds, had doubled in size, but there was no market for them in Texas. So they needed ways of getting these cattle north to the railroads so that they could get to the East Coast where there was a market for them. That began what we know of as the famous cattle drives of the American West. The Chisholm Trail is the first widely used cattle drive trail, and by the time the trail fell into disuse in 1882, hundreds of cowboys had taken thousands, tens of thousands of cattle up the trail. So we're going to use 4 images from the Chisholm Trail to drive home these 4 ideas of how to improve our communicating, our writing, and our speaking. And the first point I want you to remember is that we can use the wagon wheel as our first image of how to improve our communication. The chuck wagon wheel, if we stretched it out, would look like a ladder. And the ladder of abstraction is an important idea that writers talk about often. The ladder of abstraction is the whole idea that we have at the very top of the ladder all of the universal important ideas, the truths that you're trying to communicate. And just think about a ladder going up to the top of the sky. But down at the bottom, that ladder is leaning against a concrete sidewalk. And those are the specifics that we need to use in our writing and our speaking to get our listeners and readers to go along with us. So when you think of a ladder and you roll it up, it becomes our chuck wagon wheel. Let's look at this a little more specifically. Let me give you an example. So if you see the ladder of abstraction there on the left, that ladder going up to the sky, think about an abstract idea, something like significant events in the Old West. That's a very abstract idea. When I think of a significant event in the Old West, it's going to be very different than what you think of. But if you come down a little bit more specific, a little less abstract, we might agree, okay, we're going to talk about Old West cattle drives. Now we're thinking a little more together about a specific topic. But if you know a lot about the cattle drives, and I do, we could be thinking about very different things. Let's come down a little more specific down that ladder to cattle drives on the Chisholm Trail, which is what we're looking at today. Now we're both getting a little more on the same page. Let's come down to a very concrete, one-of-a-kind that's going to be at the bottom of that ladder of abstraction, which would be Margaret Borland and her cattle drive up the Chisholm Trail. She was a single mom. She'd lost her husband, and she had to take her 4 small children and drive her cattle up the Chisholm Trail. Quite a remarkable woman. That's a one-in-a-time event, and you see significant events in the Old West, abstract idea, all the way down to something very specific like Margaret Borland. So how does that help us as writers? Because we are always trying to communicate important ideas, and those important ideas are usually abstract ones. The Trinity, God, justification, sanctification, all those things. But in order to get people to come along with us for whatever points we're trying to make, we need to give them specifics. The first American food truck was actually the chuck wagon. So there we have our picture of our chuck wagon wheel that we're trying to use to remind ourselves as writers and speakers to use specifics to help people come along with us as we're trying to bring important abstract ideas to life. And so if you think about it, a wheel, if you think of the top of the wheel being the abstract ideas, in order to get your readers to go with you, we give them abstract ideas, but they need to tie into concrete things to get traction, and then we go back to our abstract ideas. Let's look at some specifics, how you can use the wagon wheel of abstraction to get people, your readers and listeners, to move with you. One thing you can do is give people statistics. Or you can use specific examples like we did with Margaret Borland, or a specific story, a specific instance, or a quote with a voice. You want to make sure anytime you use a quote that you can hear the person that that quote came from. Or a testimony. We think of the testimony used through the gospel as an important device. Comparison can often help if we compare two different things, or using a metaphor. So let's look at those as examples. Perhaps you might want to use a statistic. From 1867 to 1887, more than 14 million head of longhorn cattle were driven from Texas to newly formed cow towns in Kansas. And along the 1,000-mile Chisholm Trail, a new folk hero was born, the American cowboy. There are a number of statistics in there and specifics, and those help people get interested in what you're talking about and understand what you're talking about. Let's look at a specific example as a second way. Many dangers face cattle drivers and cowboys. Stampedes caused by anything from lightning to a cowboy's sneeze were a common threat. A thunderstorm near Waco in 1876, for instance, caused a herd of 15,000 longhorns to plunge into a steep ravine, killing several thousand cattle and injuring many of the riders. Crossing rivers was a dangerous affair, and other dangers include blizzards, prairie fires, and predatory animals. All those are specifics, much more interesting than just saying the cowboys faced a lot of dangers. Or you could give a specific instance, a story. Here is George Glenn. He followed the Chisholm Trail to Kansas with a herd in 1870, and when his employer died there, Glenn volunteered to return his body to Texas for burial, making that 42-day trip alone. We can also use a quote with a voice. Sometimes we use quotes because they just sound very scholarly or something, but really what we want to do is use a quote where you can hear the person talking. Charlie Willis, a former Slade, rode the Wyoming Trail during the 1870s. His great-grandson said, he had a knack for singing. He had a gift. His voice was real soothing to the cattle, and that's why the men wanted him to participate in these big cattle drives, because he would sing to the cattle and just make them relax. Or we can use testimonies. Here's a testimony from one of the cowboys that was on the trail. I believe the worst hardship we had on the trail was loss of sleep. Our day wouldn't end until about 9 o'clock when we grazed the herd onto the bed ground. And after that, every man in the outfit except the boss and the horse wrangler and cook would have to stand 2 hours night guard. I'd get maybe 5 hours sleep when the weather was nice and everything was smooth and pretty. If it wasn't so nice, you'd be lucky to sleep an hour, but the wagon rolled on in the morning just the same. Or we could use a metaphor where we're comparing something known to something that we're trying to explain. A cowboy's life is a royal life, his saddle, a kingly throne. I don't know that I've ever thought about a saddle being a throne. So that's another one. Or we can use comparisons and contrasts. I was intrigued by these different signs of help wanted and the difference between the trail boss versus the cook versus the cowboy versus the wrangler, what their jobs were and the difference in the pay. Just kind of helps you get a grasp on what was going on in those trail rides. The second way to help people remember your point is to use spurs. When a cowboy would use the spurs on the horse would bolt forward. We can do the same thing by enlisting vivid verbs and concrete nouns in our writing and speaking. And by that I mean we can choose dense nouns. Instead of using the term rider, we can use trail boss or a biscuit shooter, the cook, the wrangler, or the cowboy. There's much more meaning packed into each of those than just rider. We can also use things like they did on the trail. Instead of raisins and rice concoction, spotted pup. That's much more vivid, isn't it? There was a gelatin dessert called Shivering Liz, and pancakes were called spatterdabs. We can add color and denseness, meaning to our words when we choose nouns that have a lot of meaning embedded in them. A dense word, said Gary Provost, crowds a lot of meaning in a small space. The fewer words you use to express an idea, the more impact the idea will have. And the same is true with our verbs. Verbs are the engine in any sentence. So instead of using the word walk, picture what that person's doing. Are they strolling? Are they striding or loping? Are they hopping or trampsing? As you are working on your last draft of your writing or your speaking, look at your verbs and those action verbs. Are you using vivid verbs because they will really help people see what you're saying? The third thing I want to tell you to help people remember your point is to have a point. If you look at the longhorn steer, the number one thing that sticks out to most people is the longhorn on the steer. And those horns were very sharp. We need to, as writers and speakers, have a point and stick to that point in order for people to get what we're saying. So we can have great stories and great examples, but if we aren't tying those into making a point, it doesn't really matter. So ask yourself in one sentence, what am I exactly trying to say? That will help you create in one sentence your idea, your main point, so that you can revolve everything you're writing or speaking around that one point. The fourth way I want to help you remember is to help people remember your point by using a harmonica. Make sure your words sing. And in order to do that, in order to tell, we need to read our words aloud. Now, sometimes you're giving an impromptu speech, but usually pastors are often writing out their messages ahead of time, or your blogs, or whatever you're writing. You're writing those things out, whether you're giving it orally or whether you're publishing them. So read your words aloud. Here's Gary Provost, who gives a great example of this. He says, this sentence has 5 words. Here are 5 more words. 5-word sentences are fine, but several together become monotonous. Listen to what's happening. The writing is getting boring. The sound of it drones. It's like a stuck record. The ear demands variety. Now listen. I vary the sentence length and I create music. Music. The writing sings. It has a pleasant rhythm, a lilt, a harmony. I use short sentences and I use sentences of medium length. And sometimes, when I am certain the reader is rested, I will engage him with a sentence of considerable length, a sentence that burns with energy and builds with all the impetus of a crescendo, the roll of the drums, the crash of the cymbals, sounds that say, listen to this, it's important. A short sentence is really good if you're trying to make a point. Quick, just at the end of anything, you just want to have a short sentence. But a long sentence will take your people on a journey. So what we want to remember is something that Dr. Seuss said. He said, so the writer who breeds more words than he needs is making a chore for the reader who reads. We want to make sure that whether we're using vivid verbs or concrete nouns or watching the length of our sentences, that they all make sense, that every word matters, that each one is moving our reader forward and not just filling up space. Here's Jesse Chisholm, and he's the one for whom the trail, most historians believe the trail was named. He was not an early Texas cattleman, as people assume. He never drove a single herd of beef up his namesake trail. He was half Cherokee, half Scottish, and considered a brilliant linguist who spoke 14 tribal dialects. He was a trader, an explorer, a scout, and a diplomat who was a part of many of the important negotiations between the whites and the Native Americans in Texas and Oklahoma. His biographer called him an ambassador of the plains. And through our words, we want to be ambassadors of the gospel. So it matters how we use words. The greatest truths require the clearest writing, say Marsha Owenson. And she's right. So you have an important message to share with your readers and listeners, and we want to make sure that you share it well and compellingly. The point of all 4 of these points is that as people who are communicating important messages, things that matter to the kingdom, we need to remember something my friend Marsha Owenson said to every one of her writing classes. The greatest truths require the clearest writing. So we can use these 4 and other points to help us become compelling and clear communicators for the gospel and the kingdom's sake.